Hello friends, welcome back to another deep dive into history's darkest chapters. Today we're exploring a topic that will make you grateful for every modern convenience you take for granted. Before we begin this journey through one of humanity's most brutal eras, get comfortable, dim those lights and settle in for the night. If you'd like to share what time it is where you are, or just say hello in the comments, I'd love that. There's something comforting about knowing we're all here together, learning about our shared past from the safety and warmth of our modern lives. Now, let's transport ourselves back to a time when life was truly nasty, brutish, and devastatingly short. Picture this: you wake up tomorrow, but instead of your comfortable mattress, you're lying on a pile of rotting straw that you share with your entire extended family and your livestock. The overwhelming stench hits you immediately, a nauseating cocktail of human excrement, animal waste, decaying food, and unwashed bodies that have never encountered soap. There's no bathroom, no running water, no electricity, and definitely no morning coffee to help you face the day ahead. Welcome to medieval life, where death lurked around every corner and survival was a daily miracle. You might think you're tough enough to handle it. After all, you've dealt with power outages, camping trips, maybe even some challenging living situations. But medieval life wasn't just uncomfortable, it was systematically designed to kill you through 1,000 different mechanisms that modern people can barely comprehend. Today, we're going to explore every aspect of medieval existence that would destroy you from the moment you opened your eyes until the moment you inevitably died, which would happen far sooner than you can imagine. We'll examine the diseases that would ravage your body, the laws that would execute you for crimes you didn't know existed, and the social systems that would crush your soul long before they finished off your physical form. But first, let's establish just how alien medieval life was compared to anything in your experience. The average medieval peasant, and remember, 85% of the population were peasants, worked 16 hours daily during harvest season, slept on moldy, parasite-infested straw, consumed the same monotonous gruel for months on end, and lived in constant terror of starvation, disease, violence, and death. They had absolutely no concept of privacy, personal hygiene, individual rights, or leisure time. The medieval mindset was fundamentally different from ours. People genuinely believed that disease was divine punishment or demonic possession. They were convinced the earth was flat and that celestial bodies controlled human destiny. They accepted that most children would perish before reaching adulthood and that women were inherently inferior creatures. They inhabited a world where superstition replaced science, where might determined right, and where suffering was considered humanity's natural state. Life expectancy statistics tell the horrifying story. If you were fortunate enough to survive birth, and roughly 30% of infants didn't, you could expect to live maybe 35 years as a peasant, or 45 if you were nobility. These numbers are actually misleading because they include devastating infant mortality rates. If you somehow made it to age 10, you might reach 50, but every single year would be filled with hardships that would shatter the spirit of any modern person. The medieval calendar wasn't marked by holidays or vacation time, but by cycles of planting and harvest, fasting and feast, epidemic and recovery. People measured their existence not in achievements or experiences, but in simple survival from one brutal season to the next. So prepare yourself, because we're about to journey through one of history's most dangerous periods, and by the end, you'll be kissing the ground of the 21st century. Chapter 1. Your medieval home, a death trap disguised as shelter. Let's begin with your living situation, though living is an optimistic term for what you'd experience. Your typical medieval peasant home was a single-room hovel constructed from whatever materials could be scrounged locally. In England, this meant wattle and daub, essentially a wooden skeleton packed with a mixture of mud, animal dung, and straw. The walls stood maybe 6 feet high, built by weaving thin branches between vertical posts, then coating the entire structure with a mixture that was equal parts clay, cow manure, and chopped straw. The roof was thatched with more straw, which might sound quaint until you realized it was an ideal breeding ground for rats, insects, and every conceivable parasite. The thatch needed to be at least a foot thick to provide any protection from rain, but it was never completely waterproof. During storms, water would constantly drip through, transforming the dirt floor into a muddy swamp. Speaking of that floor, there was no wooden planking, no stone tiles, no proper flooring whatsoever. Just packed earth, sometimes mixed with clay if you were incredibly fortunate. This dirt surface was covered with rushes or straw that served simultaneously as carpet, bedding, and garbage disposal system. These floor coverings were replaced perhaps once or twice yearly, creating a festering mat of rotting organic matter mixed with food scraps, animal waste, human bodily fluids, and everything else that fell or was spilled during daily activities. Archaeologists excavating medieval peasant homes have discovered floor layers containing chicken bones, fish scales, vegetable peelings, broken pottery, lost tools, children's toys, and yes, human feces, all compressed into layers that tell the story of medieval domestic life in the most revolting way imaginable. But here's where it gets truly delightful. You wouldn't live alone in this charming space. Your medieval home was shared with your entire extended family and your livestock. That's correct, your cows, pigs, chickens, and goats all resided in the same room as you and your children. A typical peasant cottage was divided into roughly 2 sections, about 2/3 for the human family and 1/3 for the animals, separated by nothing more than a low wooden fence or wattle barrier. The animals weren't temporary guests, they were permanent residents. During winter, having them indoors was essential for survival. Their body heat helped warm the space, and their valuable lives needed protection from thieves and predators. But this arrangement meant you constantly breathed animal dander, dealt with overwhelming odors from their waste, and shared your living space with all the diseases and parasites they carried. The medieval family unit was significantly larger than modern families. A typical household might include grandparents, parents, children, unmarried siblings, and various other relatives who had nowhere else to go. Add occasional guests or hired workers, and you might have 15 people crammed into roughly 400 square feet. Privacy was a concept that simply didn't exist. Everything happened in full view of everyone else: birth, death, illness, intimate moments, arguments, celebrations, and daily bodily functions. Children grew up witnessing every aspect of adult life, including experiences that would be considered deeply traumatic by modern standards. Your only source of heat and light was a fire pit in the room's center. Most peasant homes had no chimney, just a hole in the roof directly above the fire pit. This meant your house was constantly filled with smoke that burned your eyes, damaged your lungs, and covered everything in a layer of soot. The smoke was so dense that medieval people regularly suffered from serious respiratory problems and eye diseases directly caused by these smoky environments. The fire pit served multiple purposes: cooking, heating, and illumination. But maintaining a fire was an endless challenge. Fuel was expensive and difficult to obtain. Wood had to be gathered wherever possible, and during winter, families would sometimes burn furniture, tools, or even parts of their house structure to stay warm. Sleep meant carefully banking the fire so it wouldn't extinguish completely, because starting a new fire was difficult and time-consuming. Lighting after dark was minimal and precious. Candles were expensive luxuries made from animal fat or beeswax. Most people used rushlights, dried reed soaked in animal fat that burned for maybe 20 minutes, 30 minutes. A typical family might use 1 or 2 rushlights per evening, providing just enough illumination to see immediate surroundings. Most activity ceased at sunset simply because adequate light didn't exist to continue. The absence of windows meant your home was incredibly dark during daytime and pitch black at night. The last was a luxury completely beyond common people's reach, so if any window openings existed at all, they were simply holes in walls that could be covered with oiled cloth, animal skins, or wooden shutters. These openings were typically small and few, since larger ones would admit rain, snow, and cold air. This perpetual dimness contributed to vitamin D deficiency and numerous health problems. Medieval people frequently suffered from rickets, bone deformities, and other conditions related to inadequate sunlight exposure. The psychological effects of living in constant twilight cannot be overstated. Depression and seasonal affective disorder were common, though completely misunderstood and untreated. Furniture was minimal and crudely constructed. You might possess a few 3-legged stools, a rough wooden table made from planks laid across supports, some storage chests or baskets, and basic cooking implements. Everything was handmade by family members or local craftsmen using simple tools. Comfort was never considered. Functionality and durability were the only priorities. Your bed was straw on the floor, shared with your entire family and possibly some smaller animals. The straw was infested with fleas, lice, and other parasites. Blankets were rough woolen cloth or animal skins that were heavy, scratchy, and rarely washed. Your pillow was a bundle of rags or a small sack stuffed with straw or feathers if you were extraordinarily fortunate. Sleep was fitful and constantly interrupted. Animals would make noise throughout the night. Family members would cough, snore, and move about. Children would cry. The fire needed tending. Fleas and lice would bite and crawl. The overwhelming smell was inescapable. Rain might drip through the roof. Cold drafts would blow through wall gaps. The structural integrity of these homes was questionable at best. Medieval building techniques were primitive, and materials were often green wood that warped and cracked as it dried. Foundations were minimal or non-existent. Walls could collapse without warning, especially during storms or after heavy rains. Roofs could cave in under snow weight or during high winds. Fire was a constant threat. The combination of open flames, dry thatch roofing, and wooden construction made house fires frequent and devastating. Many medieval people died in house fires, and entire neighborhoods could burn when flames spread from building to building. There were no fire departments, no suppression systems, and no building codes to prevent disasters. But perhaps the most dangerous aspect of medieval homes was invisible to microscopic threats. These houses were breeding grounds for bacteria, viruses, parasites, and fungal infections. The combination of poor ventilation, animal waste, rotting organic matter, and overcrowded conditions created perfect environments for disease transmission. The floor rushes harbored countless pathogens. Walls were damp and moldy. Air was thick with dust, smoke, and airborne contaminants. Everything you touched was contaminated with germs that could cause serious illness or death. Water had to be carried from wells, streams, or public sources that were often contaminated. Storage was in wooden buckets or clay vessels that were extremely difficult to keep clean. Most families rationed water heavily, using it first for drinking and cooking, then for washing dishes, and finally for basic hygiene if any remained. Waste disposal was primitive and dangerous. Human waste was collected in chamber pots that were emptied into streets, ditches, or nearby fields. There was no sewage system, no garbage collection, and no understanding of how waste disposal affected health. The area around most medieval homes was contaminated with human and animal waste that created breeding grounds for disease. Food storage was a constant battle. Without refrigeration, everything required preservation through smoking, salting, drying, or fermentation. Root cellars dug into the ground provided some cool storage, but they were often damp and prone to flooding. Grain was stored in wooden chests or baskets, offering little protection from rodents and insects. Rats and mice were constant companions in medieval homes. They contaminated food supplies, spread diseases, and caused property damage. Cats were kept to control rodent populations, but even the best mices couldn't completely eliminate the problem. Some families kept small dogs for the same purpose, but these animals added to overcrowding and sanitation problems. The psychological impact of living in such conditions was devastating. The constant stress of overcrowding, lack of comfort and privacy, ever-present smells and smoke, and knowledge that your home could collapse or burn at any moment created chronic anxiety and depression that shortened lives even beyond the physical health threats. For women, the home environment was particularly challenging. They spent most time indoors, exposed to smoke and poor air quality while cooking and managing household tasks. Pregnancy and childbirth in these unsanitary conditions led to high rates of infection and death for both mothers and babies. Your medieval home wasn't a sanctuary or place of comfort, it was a survival challenge that tested your endurance every single day. The very place meant to protect you from the outside world was slowly killing you from within. Chapter 2, The Hygiene Nightmare When Cleanliness was literally deadly. One of the most horrifying aspects of medieval life was the complete absence of hygiene and proper sanitation that would shock even the most hardened modern person. Medieval people lived in conditions of filth that created perfect breeding grounds for disease, parasites, and death. Waste disposal was a daily nightmare that turned every street into an open sewer. Human excrement was regularly thrown out of windows with nothing more than the shouted warning garde-l'eau, a corruption of the French gardes à l'eau meaning watch out for water. The streets below became rivers of human waste mixed with animal droppings, rotting food, and industrial runoff from various trades. The famous medieval saying, "Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater," existed because families often shared the same water for bathing, first the father, then other men, then women, then children, and finally babies. By the time it was the baby's turn, the water was so dark and filthy that an infant could literally be lost in it. Public latrines, where they existed, were communal nightmares. Rows of holes in wooden planks with no privacy, no cleaning, and no sanitation. The waste dropped into cesspits below that were rarely emptied and frequently overflowed. The smell was so overwhelming that many people preferred to relieve themselves in the streets rather than endure these public facilities. Private homes used chamber pots that were emptied into streets, gardens, or rivers. The job of emptying these pots often fell to children or servants, exposing them to constant contamination. The pots themselves were rarely cleaned properly and became breeding grounds for bacteria and parasites. Wells and water sources were routinely contaminated by nearby latrines and animal waste. The medieval understanding of water contamination was non-existent. People knew certain water sources made them sick but had no concept of why or how to purify water safely. Many wells were located dangerously close to cesspits, ensuring that drinking water was thoroughly contaminated with human waste. Soap was an expensive luxury made from animal fat and wood ash. The process was labor-intensive and the results were harsh on skin. Most people went their entire lives without using soap, instead relying on sand, rough cloths, or simply water for any cleaning they might attempt. Bathing was not only rare, but actively discouraged by medical and religious authorities. Medieval doctors believed that bathing opened the pores and made people susceptible to disease. They thought dirt actually protected the skin and that washing it away left people vulnerable to illness. Some religious authorities considered frequent bathing a sign of vanity or even immoral behavior. When people did bathe, it was often in the same water used by many others. Public bathhouses existed in some cities, but were notorious for spreading disease. These facilities were often fronts for prostitution and were considered morally questionable places that decent people avoided. Personal hygiene was virtually non-existent. People rarely washed their hands, even after using the latrine or before eating. The concept of germs was unknown, so there was no understanding of how diseases spread through contact. People ate with unwashed hands, handled raw meat and human waste with the same hands, and saw nothing problematic about this behavior. Clothing was rarely washed and often worn for months or even years without cleaning. Garments were passed down through generations, accumulating layers of dirt, sweat, and bodily fluids. The wealthy might have multiple sets of clothing, but even they rarely washed their garments more than a few times per year. Undergarments, where they existed, were made of rough linen that chafed the skin and were changed infrequently. Many people wore the same underclothes for weeks at a time, creating perfect breeding grounds for lice, fleas, and other parasites. Parasites were constant companions for medieval people. Lice infested hair and clothing, causing constant itching and spreading typhus. Fleas jumped from person to person and animal to animal, transmitting plague and other diseases. Bedbugs turned sleep into a nightmare of itching and blood loss. Scabies mites burrowed under skin, causing intense itching and secondary infections. The treatment for parasites was often worse than the infestation. People would apply mercury, sulfur, or other toxic substances to their skin and hair. These treatments often caused poisoning, chemical burns, and death. Some people tried to kill lice by holding their clothes over fires, regularly setting themselves ablaze in the process. Hair was rarely washed and became matted with grease, dirt, and parasites. Many people never brushed or combed their hair, allowing it to form permanent tangles called elf locks that were considered impossible to remove. The scalp became a breeding ground for infections, lice, and fungal diseases. Dental hygiene was unknown. People never brushed their teeth, and dental decay was universal. Tooth pain was constant for most adults, and tooth loss was expected. The smell of rotting teeth and infected gums added to the overwhelming stench that surrounded medieval people. Breath was so universally foul that it was considered normal. The combination of rotting teeth, poor diet, and digestive problems caused by parasites created breath so offensive that medieval people carried herbs and spices to cover the smell when interacting with others. Skin diseases were endemic. The combination of poor hygiene, malnutrition, and constant exposure to contaminants caused widespread skin problems. Boils, rashes, infections, and open sores covered people's bodies. These wounds often became seriously infected, leading to blood poisoning and death. The psychological impact of living in such filthy conditions cannot be overstated. The constant itching from parasites, the overwhelming smells, and the visible dirt and grime created a level of discomfort that modern people cannot imagine. Yet medieval people had no choice but to accept these conditions as normal. Understanding these horrific sanitary conditions is essential to comprehending why medieval life was so dangerous and why death rates were so high. Every aspect of daily life exposed people to disease and infection. The simplest scratch could become infected and lead to sepsis. The combination of poor hygiene, malnutrition, and parasites created a perfect storm of health problems that made survival a daily miracle. Chapter 3: Food and Famine When Your Next Meal Could Be Your Last. Now that we've established the horrific conditions people lived in, let's discuss food, or more accurately, the desperate lack thereof. In medieval times, eating wasn't about pleasure or even adequate nutrition, it was about not dying of starvation. For most people, that was a daily challenge consuming their every waking moment. The medieval diet was monotonous, inadequate, and dangerous. For the average peasant, meals consisted mainly of bread, porridge, and whatever vegetables could be grown locally. Meat was a rare luxury reserved for special occasions, and even then it was often spoiled, diseased, or of questionable origin. Bread was the cornerstone of the medieval diet, comprising 70–80% of daily calories for most people. But this wasn't the fluffy white bread you know. Medieval bread was made from whatever grain was available, wheat if you were incredibly fortunate and wealthy, but more often barley, oats, rye, or even beans and peas ground into flour. The bread was dark, coarse, dense, and frequently contaminated with dirt, insects, stones, and rodent droppings mixed in during growing, harvesting, and grinding processes. Bread quality varied dramatically based on social status and local conditions. The wealthy might obtain white bread made from carefully sifted wheat flour, but peasants typically ate dark bread barely recognizable as bread by modern standards. Sometimes grain was so poor it was mixed with sawdust, crushed acorns, or even clay to extend supplies. Making bread was a complex and dangerous process. First, grain had to be ground into flour using stone mills that often left grit and stone particles in the flour. This debris wore down people's teeth and caused serious dental problems. The flour was then mixed with water to make dough, but the water was often contaminated and mixing bowls were rarely clean. Baking required access to an oven, which most peasant families didn't possess. In many villages, there was one communal oven owned by the manor lord. Peasants had to pay to use this oven and wait their turn, sometimes for days. During busy periods like harvest time, families might go without fresh bread for weeks. But here's the truly terrifying aspect: grain used for bread was often infected with ergot, a fungus-producing compound similar to LSD. Ergot contamination caused a condition called St. Anthony's fire, leading to hallucinations, convulsions, gangrene, and death. Entire communities would sometimes be poisoned by ergot-contaminated bread, resulting in outbreaks of madness, mass hysteria, and horrific deaths. Ergot poisoning symptoms were nightmarish. Victims experienced burning sensations in their extremities, followed by gangrene causing fingers, toes, hands, and feet to literally fall off. Others suffered convulsions so violent they broke their own bones. Many hallucinated terrifying visions before dying in agony. What made this even more horrifying was that people had no understanding of what caused these symptoms. They attributed ergot poisoning to witchcraft, divine punishment, or demonic possession. Communities would sometimes turn on each other, accusing neighbors of casting spells or making deals with the devil, when in reality they were all being slowly poisoned by their daily bread. Vegetables were limited to what could be grown locally and preserved without refrigeration. The medieval vegetable garden was nothing like modern produce sections. Cabbage, onions, leeks, turnips, carrots, and beans were most common, but they were often small, tough, and bitter compared to modern varieties. These vegetables were typically stored in root cellars where they slowly rotted or became infested with insects and worms. By late winter and early spring, stored vegetables would be moldy, sprouted, or completely spoiled. People ate them anyway rather than starve, leading to frequent food poisoning and nutritional deficiencies. Fresh vegetables were only available during growing season, which was much shorter than in modern agricultural systems. For 6 months or more each year, people had to survive on whatever stored vegetables remained, often eating roots and leaves barely recognizable as food. Fruit was even rarer and more seasonal than vegetables. Most medieval people went their entire lives eating fresh fruit only a few times. Apples and pears could be stored for a few months in cold conditions, but they quickly became soft and rotten. Other fruits like berries had to be eaten immediately when ripe or preserved by drying, which removed most nutritional value. Food preservation was a constant struggle against time and decay. Without refrigeration, meat had to be salted, smoked, or dried, processes that didn't always work perfectly and often made meat nearly inedible. Salt was expensive and often contained impurities that added strange flavors and colors to preserved foods. Smoking meat required constant attention to maintain proper temperature and smoke density. Too little smoke meant spoilage. Too much heat cooked rather than preserved. The process could take days or weeks, and there was always risk that something would go wrong and entire supplies would be lost. Salted meat was incredibly tough and salty, requiring hours of soaking before consumption. Even then, it was often so hard it had to be ground up or boiled into mush. Salt used for preservation was often contaminated with sand, dirt, and other impurities, adding to unpleasant texture and taste. But the real horror of medieval eating wasn't just poor food quality, it was a constant threat of famine. Crop failures due to bad weather, plant diseases, or insect infestations could mean starvation for entire regions. The Great Famine of 1350–1322 killed between 10–25% of Northern Europe's population. People literally starved to death in streets while others watched helplessly. This famine's psychological impact was devastating. Contemporary chronicles describe people eating bark from trees, grass from fields, and leather from shoes and belts. Some resorted to eating clay, hoping it would fill their stomachs despite providing no nutrition. Others turned to eating non-food items, sawdust, animal droppings, even poisonous plants they knew might kill them but hoped might provide sustenance. During the worst famines, cannibalism became documented reality. Parents faced unthinkable choices about which children to feed and which to abandon. Some families sent their weakest members away to die alone rather than watch them starve slowly. Markets sold human flesh alongside what little animal meat was available. Social breakdown during famines was complete and terrifying. Normal moral codes disappeared when people were dying of hunger. Food theft became punishable by immediate execution, but people still risked death to steal a single loaf of bread. Children were abandoned by parents who couldn't feed them. The elderly were left to die so younger family members might survive. Even in normal years, famine threat was never distant. Medieval agriculture was primitive and unreliable. A single hailstorm could destroy an entire year's crop. Too much rain caused grain to rot in fields. Too little rain caused drought and crop failure. Insect swarms could devour entire harvests in days. There was no way to predict or prevent these agricultural disasters, and no way to import food from distant regions when local crops failed. Communities were entirely dependent on what they could grow themselves, and when that failed, they faced starvation with no hope of relief. Food preparation was almost as dangerous as finding it. Cooking was done over open fires using crude utensils made of wood or poorly forged metal. Burns were common and often serious. House fires started by cooking accidents killed thousands annually. Cooking pots made of clay could crack and spill boiling liquids, causing severe injuries. Food storage was primitive and ineffective. Grain was kept in wooden containers, offering little protection from rodents, insects, and moisture. Rats and mice contaminated food supplies with their droppings and urine, spreading diseases like plague. Weevils and other insects infested stored grain, making it barely edible even when it didn't cause illness. The seasonal nature of food availability created a yearly cycle of plenty and want dominating medieval life. Even in good years, the period between winter food stores ending and new harvest, called the Hunger Gap, was a time of severe shortages. People would lose significant weight during these periods, and many died from malnutrition-related diseases. Your relationship with food in medieval times would be fundamentally different from today. Food was scarce, precious, and never taken for granted. Every meal could be your last, and every bite was a victory against starvation. This created a relationship with food based on desperation rather than pleasure, a constant reminder that you were always just one crop failure away from death. Chapter 4: Daily Life Hazards and Superstitions when every day brought new ways to dying. Beyond the obvious threats of disease, starvation, and poor sanitation, medieval daily life was filled with countless smaller dangers that could prove fatal. Every routine task, every common practice, every superstitious remedy was potentially deadly in ways that medieval people never understood. Cooking over open fires with primitive equipment led to frequent burns, scaldings, and house fires. The medieval kitchen was essentially a controlled explosion waiting to happen. Open flames, loose clothing, wooden structures, and flammable thatch roofing created perfect conditions for disaster. Clothing made from loose, flowing fabrics regularly caught fire, burning people alive in their own homes. Women's long dresses and veils were particularly dangerous around cooking fires. The heavy woolen and linen fabrics used in medieval clothing burned quickly and were difficult to extinguish once ignited. Many women died horrible deaths when their clothing caught fire while cooking, with no effective way to stop the flames from consuming them completely. Without proper medical treatment, even minor burns often became infected and fatal. Medieval people had no understanding of burn treatment and often applied substances that made injuries worse. They might pack burns with animal dung, thinking it would help healing, or apply various oils and herbs that actually increased infection risk. Common household items were toxic in ways that medieval people never suspected. Lead was used extensively in pottery glazes, slowly poisoning entire families through their daily meals. Every dish, cup, and cooking vessel leached toxic metals into food and drink, causing neurological damage, organ failure, and death over months or years. The wealthy faced particular danger from lead poisoning because they could afford pewter dishes and lead-glazed pottery. Ironically, their superior economic status meant they were more likely to suffer from heavy metal poisoning than peasants who ate from wooden bowls and clay vessels. Mercury was prescribed as medicine for everything from skin conditions to sexually transmitted diseases. This deadly poison caused neurological damage, kidney failure, and death, but medieval doctors believed it had curative properties. Patients were given mercury in pills applied as ointments or even inhaled as vapors, leading to mercury poisoning that was often worse than their original conditions. Many dyes and pigments contained arsenic and other deadly compounds that slowly poisoned people who worked with them or wore clothing treated with these substances. The beautiful colors prized in medieval textiles often came from toxic materials that caused skin irritation, organ damage, and death over time. The medieval practice of bloodletting, intended as medical treatment, killed more people than it helped. Barber surgeons used the same unsterilized tools on multiple patients, spreading infections and diseases from person to person. The crude knives and lancets used for bloodletting often caused more damage than the original ailments they were meant to treat. Bloodletting was performed for almost any medical condition, from headaches to plague. The theory was that removing bad blood would restore health, but in reality, the procedure weakened patients and often introduced deadly infections. Many people died from blood loss or infection caused by bloodletting rather than from their original illnesses. Superstitious remedies were often more dangerous than the problems they were meant to solve. People ingested poisonous plants, toxic metals, and dangerous compounds based on folk beliefs about their healing properties. These cures were passed down through generations without any understanding of their actual effects on human health. Some common medieval remedies included drinking urine to cure various ailments, eating ground pearls for stomach problems, and applying moldy bread to wounds. While some folk remedies had legitimate medical value, many were harmful or deadly when used incorrectly or in dangerous combinations. Religious relics were believed to have healing powers, leading people to ingest ground-up bones, drink water that had been used to wash holy objects, and apply various blessed substances to their bodies. These practices often introduced infections and toxins while providing no actual medical benefit. Work-related injuries were common and usually fatal due to primitive safety measures and dangerous working conditions. Farming accidents with sharp tools occurred daily, as medieval agricultural implements were crude and dangerous. Scythes, sickles, and other harvesting tools regularly caused severe cuts that became infected and led to death from sepsis. Construction injuries from primitive building techniques claimed thousands of lives annually. Medieval builders worked without safety equipment on unstable structures using heavy materials and dangerous tools. Falls from scaffolding, crushing injuries from falling stones, and cuts from sharp tools were daily occurrences that often proved fatal. Mining was particularly dangerous, with cave-ins and toxic fumes killing workers regularly. Medieval mines were poorly supported and poorly ventilated, creating conditions where workers faced constant threats of suffocation, crushing, or poisoning from underground gases. Even entertainment was dangerous in medieval times. Medieval sports were violent and frequently fatal, designed more to train warriors than provide safe recreation. Tournaments regularly resulted in serious injuries and deaths, with participants competing in full combat using real weapons and minimal protective equipment. Wrestling matches, boxing contests, and other competitions often ended in permanent injury or death. The concept of safety regulations or medical supervision was completely unknown, so competitions continued even when participants were seriously injured. Weather posed constant and unpredictable dangers to medieval people who had no reliable way to predict or prepare for severe conditions. Lightning strikes, floods, windstorms, and extreme temperatures killed thousands of people who had no understanding of meteorology or weather safety. Medieval people believed weather was controlled by supernatural forces and tried to influence it through prayers, rituals, and superstitious practices. These beliefs prevented them from developing practical strategies for weather safety and often led them to take dangerous actions based on false assumptions about natural phenomena. The cumulative effect of all these daily hazards was that medieval people faced constant life-threatening dangers from activities that seem routine and safe by modern standards. Every day was filled with decisions and activities that could easily result in serious injury or death, creating a level of stress and anxiety that modern people can barely comprehend. Chapter 5. Disease and Medicine, where cures were more deadly than the diseases. If somehow your hovel didn't kill you, the filth didn't poison you, starvation didn't claim you, and daily hazards didn't finish you off, don't worry, medieval medicine was standing by to complete the job. Welcome to an era where doctors believed that bad odors could cure disease, where surgery was performed with the same tools used to butcher animals, and where the treatment was almost guaranteed to be more lethal than whatever was actually wrong with you. Life expectancy in medieval times was brutally short, with disease serving as the primary executioner. If you managed to survive the dangerous process of being born, and roughly 30% of babies didn't, you could expect to live perhaps 35 years if you were a peasant, maybe 45 if you were fortunate enough to be born into nobility. The concept of retirement, of gracefully aging, of watching grandchildren grow up, these were fantasies beyond medieval imagination. Disease was everywhere, and it was remarkably creative in its methods of destroying you. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the 14th century, eliminated between 30 and 60% of the population in many regions. But plague was merely one assassin in an army of killers that stalked medieval communities daily. Tuberculosis, which medieval people called consumption, was perhaps the most feared disease because of its slow, agonizing method of killing. The disease would gradually waste away its victims over months or years, causing them to cough up increasing amounts of blood while losing dramatic amounts of weight before eventually dying in excruciating pain. The disease spread easily through the overcrowded, poorly ventilated living conditions we described earlier. Entire families would be systematically wiped out as tuberculosis passed from person to person in their cramped homes. Children would watch their parents slowly waste away, fully understanding they would likely be next. The psychological trauma of living with consumption was nearly as devastating as the physical symptoms, creating a constant atmosphere of dread and hopelessness. Medieval understanding of tuberculosis was not only completely wrong, but actively harmful. Doctors believed the disease was caused by corrupted air or evil vapors, leading to treatments that made patients significantly worse. They would prescribe bloodletting to weaken already fragile patients, or recommend exposure to good air that often meant sitting in cold, damp conditions that accelerated the disease's deadly progress. Dysentery, caused by contaminated water and the appalling sanitation we've discussed, killed through violent diarrhea and rapid dehydration. The disease was so commonplace that medieval people accepted it as a normal part of existence, like catching a seasonal cold. But dysentery could kill within days, particularly children and elderly people whose bodies couldn't withstand the severe fluid loss. The constant presence of human waste in streets and water sources meant dysentery epidemics swept through communities with terrifying regularity. During outbreaks, entire households would be struck down simultaneously, leaving nobody healthy enough to care for the sick. People would die of dehydration while lying in their own waste, too weak to call for help that probably wouldn't have arrived anyway. Medieval treatments for dysentery were not merely useless, but frequently fatal. Doctors would prescribe additional bloodletting to drain the corrupted humors or administer powerful purgatives that caused even more catastrophic fluid loss. Some physicians recommended drinking wine mixed with crushed pearls or gold dust, expensive remedies that accomplished nothing except bankrupting families while their loved ones died horrible deaths. Typhus, spread by the lice and fleas that infested everyone due to poor hygiene, thrived in medieval living conditions. The disease caused extremely high fevers, severe headaches, and characteristic rashes before killing victims through organ failure. Since personal cleanliness was virtually non-existent and people rarely washed their clothes or bedding, everyone harbored the insects that transmitted this killer. Medieval response to typhus outbreaks was to dramatically increase religious observances, believing God was punishing the community for collective sins. This meant organizing more crowded church services where the disease could spread even faster among the faithful. Some communities organized mass processions where hundreds of infected people would march through streets, spreading lice and disease to everyone they encountered. While the Black Death rightfully captures attention as the most devastating medieval pandemic, countless other diseases ravaged medieval populations with equal cruelty but less historical fame. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, was endemic among populations with limited access to fresh fruits and vegetables. The disease began subtly with fatigue and joint pain, but progressed to horrifying symptoms that medieval people couldn't understand or treat. Victims' teeth would fall out, leaving bloody, infected gums. Old wounds would reopen spontaneously as the body lost its ability to maintain scar tissue. Joint swelling became so severe that movement was excruciating, and many sufferers became completely bedridden. The psychological symptoms of scurvy were as devastating as the physical ones. Victims became deeply depressed and developed paranoid delusions. Some medieval accounts describe scurvy sufferers becoming violent and irrational, leading to them being treated as mentally ill or possessed by demons. The disease caused excruciating pain that never stopped, driving many victims to suicide as the only escape from their torment. Rickets, caused by vitamin D deficiency from lack of sunlight and poor nutrition, left children with permanently deformed bones and stunted growth. Medieval children with rickets developed severe spinal curvatures that created hunchbacks and twisted limbs. Their leg bones couldn't support their body weight properly, causing bow legs and knock knees that made walking painful and difficult. The bone deformities caused by rickets weren't just cosmetic problems, they created serious health complications that lasted throughout victims' lives. Severely curved spines compressed internal organs, making breathing difficult and digestion problematic. Deformed pelvic bones made childbirth even more dangerous for women, leading to increased rates of maternal and infant mortality. Ergotism, caused by fungus-infected grain, created outbreaks of madness and gangrene that terrorized entire communities. The disease came in two forms, both equally horrifying. Convulsive ergotism caused violent seizures so powerful they could break bones and tear muscles. Victims would writhe uncontrollably for hours, often injuring themselves or others during their convulsions. The gangrenous form of ergotism was even more terrifying. Victims experienced burning pain in their extremities that felt like being consumed by invisible fire. The pain was so severe that many begged to have their limbs amputated, but even amputation didn't always stop the disease's progress. Fingers, toes, hands, and feet would literally fall off as the tissue died and rotted away. What made ergotism particularly terrifying was its tendency to affect entire communities simultaneously. When a town's grain supply became contaminated with ergot fungus, hundreds of people would develop symptoms at the same time. Medieval people had no understanding of what caused these outbreaks, leading to panic and accusations of witchcraft or divine punishment. Leprosy caused progressive disfigurement and disability that led to complete social ostracism. The disease began with small patches of discolored skin that gradually spread across the victim's body. As the disease progressed, it damaged nerves, causing victims to lose feeling in their hands and feet. Without the ability to feel pain, lepers frequently injured themselves without realizing it, leading to infections and further tissue damage. The visible symptoms of leprosy were horrifying and unmistakable. Victims' faces became swollen and distorted, their noses collapsed, and their fingers and toes gradually disappeared as tissue died and fell away. The disease also affected victims' voices, causing a characteristic raspy quality that made them immediately identifiable even when they couldn't be seen. Society's treatment of lepers was incredibly cruel, even by medieval standards. People with leprosy were forced to live in isolated colonies called leprosariums, cut off from all contact with family and friends. They had to ring bells or call out warnings whenever they approached healthy people, and were forbidden from entering towns, churches, or markets. Many lepers died not from the disease itself, but from starvation and neglect caused by their social isolation. Smallpox survivors were left horribly scarred and frequently blind. The disease was highly contagious, with a mortality rate around 30%. Those fortunate enough to survive were marked for life with deep pockmarks that made them instantly recognizable as smallpox survivors. These scars weren't merely cosmetic, they often indicated underlying tissue damage that caused ongoing health problems. Medieval people believed smallpox was caused by corrupt blood and attempted treatment by making small cuts in patients' skin to release the bad blood. This practice, called scarification, often led to secondary infections that killed patients who might have survived the original disease. The cure, once again, proved deadlier than the illness. But epidemic diseases weren't the only killers. Ordinary infections that we treat effortlessly today were automatic death sentences. A simple cut from a farming implement could become infected and lead to sepsis and death within days. Broken bones that didn't heal properly could cause lifelong disability or fatal complications when fragments pierced internal organs. Medieval understanding of infection was non-existent. People had absolutely no concept of germs or bacteria, so they had no comprehension of why wounds sometimes festered and killed. They would routinely pack infected wounds with materials that made infections dramatically worse: animal dung, spider webs, moldy bread, and other substances that introduced additional harmful bacteria into open wounds. Some medieval treatments for infected wounds were so catastrophically harmful they virtually guaranteed death. Physicians would cauterize wounds with red-hot irons, destroying healthy tissue along with infected areas. Others would apply caustic substances like quicklime or acid that burned away flesh and bone. Many patients died from shock and trauma caused by these treatments rather than from their original injuries. Childbirth was extraordinarily dangerous for women, with maternal mortality rates that would horrify modern sensibilities. Without understanding of sterile technique, basic anatomy, or the mechanics of labor and delivery, midwives often cause more harm than good. Conservative estimates suggest that 10–20% of all women died in childbirth, making pregnancy a potentially fatal condition for half the population. Medieval obstetric practices were based entirely on superstition rather than medical knowledge. Midwives would place religious relics on laboring women, administer toxic herbal concoctions, or perform dangerous procedures that dramatically increased risks of infection and death. Breech births, prolonged labor, and other complications that are manageable today were automatic death sentences for both mother and child. Infant mortality was even worse than maternal mortality. Approximately half of all children died before their 5th birthday, with many more perishing before reaching adulthood. The causes were numerous and largely preventable by modern standards: birth trauma, infections, congenital defects that would be easily treatable today, accidents, malnutrition, and simple neglect. Medieval medical knowledge was a lethal mixture of ancient Greek theories, religious superstition, and folk remedies that were consistently more harmful than helpful. The dominant medical theory was based on the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Doctors believed illness resulted from imbalances of these humors, designing treatments to restore balance through methods that routinely killed patients. Bloodletting was the most common medical procedure, used to treat everything from headaches to plague. Doctors would cut veins or apply leeches to drain excess blood from patients, often weakening them so severely they died from blood loss rather than their original ailment. The amount of blood removed was sometimes enormous, up to half a patient's total blood volume in severe cases. Surgery, when it was attempted at all, was performed without anesthesia and aseptic technique or proper anatomical knowledge. Surgeons, who were often the same people who cut hair and pulled teeth, would use unsterilized instruments in filthy conditions. The mortality rate for surgical procedures was close to 100%. The medieval period represents one of the darkest chapters in medical history, where ignorance and superstition created a healthcare system that was more likely to kill than cure. But this medical nightmare was just one aspect of a society designed to destroy human life and dignity at every turn. Chapter 6: Laws and Justice, where justice was anything but just. Think modern legal systems are unfair. Medieval law would make you long for the good old days of parking tickets and jury duty. Welcome to a world where you could be executed for stealing a loaf of bread, where your guilt or innocence was determined by whether you sank when thrown into water, and where the punishment for most crimes was designed to be as publicly humiliating and painful as possible. Medieval legal systems varied by region, but they all shared certain characteristics that would terrify any modern person who values due process or human rights. The concept of innocent until proven guilty didn't exist. Justice was swift, brutal, and often completely arbitrary, based more on social status, personal relationships, and the whims of local authorities than on any consistent application of legal principles. Let's start with some of the bizarre laws that could get you killed. In medieval England, it was illegal for peasants to wear certain colours or types of clothing. Purple and ermine were reserved for royalty, and wearing them if you weren't noble could result in severe punishment, including death. These sumptuary laws were incredibly detailed, specifying exactly what fabrics, colours, and styles each social class was permitted to wear. Similarly, there were laws governing what foods different social classes were allowed to eat. A peasant caught eating swan, venison, or other noble foods could face harsh penalties, including mutilation or death. These dietary restrictions weren't just about luxury, they extended to basic nutrition, with laws limiting how much meat, white bread, and other quality foods peasants could consume. Poaching hunting animals on someone else's land was punishable by death, and this wasn't just talking about hunting royal deer in the king's forests. Even catching rabbits, birds, or fish on land that didn't belong to you could result in execution. The wealthy landowners had exclusive rights to all wildlife on their property, and they enforced these rights with deadly seriousness. The definition of poaching was so broad that it included almost any interaction with wildlife. Setting snares for rabbits, collecting eggs from wild birds, or even gathering nuts and berries could be considered poaching if done on someone else's land. Given that most peasants had no land of their own and lived surrounded by property belonging to nobles, it was almost impossible to supplement their meager diets without technically committing capital crimes. Vagrancy was another serious crime that could result in death. If you couldn't prove you had a job or a permanent home, you could be arrested, whipped, branded, mutilated, or executed. The authorities were so paranoid about unemployed people that they created harsh laws to force everyone into some form of labor, no matter how degrading or poorly paid. Religious crimes were particularly severe, reflecting the enormous power of the Catholic Church in medieval society. Heresy, having religious beliefs that differed from official church doctrine, was punishable by being burned alive at the stake. But the definition of heresy was so broad that almost any deviation from orthodox belief could be fatal. The methods of determining guilt or innocence were medieval in the worst possible way. Trial by ordeal was based on the belief that God would intervene to protect the innocent, but the ordeals were designed in ways that made survival unlikely regardless of guilt or innocence. Trial by fire required the accused to carry a red-hot iron bar for a specified distance, usually 9 paces, or walk barefoot across burning coals. The burns were then bandaged and examined 3 days later. If the wounds appeared to be healing cleanly, the person was declared innocent. If infection had set in, which was almost inevitable given medieval understanding of wound care, they were declared guilty and executed. Trial by water came in 2 varieties, both potentially fatal. In cold water ordeal, the accused was bound hand and foot and thrown into a body of water. If they sank, they were considered innocent and usually drowned in the process. If they floated, they were guilty of witchcraft and would be executed, often by burning. The punishments for crimes were designed to be as public and humiliating as possible. Public execution was common entertainment, with entire communities gathering to watch criminals die in various horrible ways. These events were often treated as festivals, with vendors selling food and drink to the crowds. Hanging was the most common form of execution, but medieval executioners often lacked the knowledge to perform it quickly and humanely. Without proper technique, victims could strangle slowly for minutes rather than dying quickly from a broken neck. Drawing and quartering was reserved for the more serious crimes, particularly treason. The victim would first be dragged through the streets behind a horse, then hanged until nearly dead, cut down while still alive, and disemboweled. Finally, they would be cut into quarters, with different body parts displayed in various locations as warnings to others. For lesser crimes, punishments included public whipping, time in the stocks or pillory, branding with hot irons, and various forms of mutilation. These penalties were designed to mark criminals permanently, making it impossible for them to escape the past or integrate into new communities. The medieval legal system was designed to maintain social order through fear rather than justice. For the average person living in medieval times, the legal system was not a source of protection but a constant threat. Any minor infraction could result in torture, mutilation, or death. Chapter 7: Medieval Childhood Nightmares. Growing up in Hell. If medieval life was brutal for adults, it was absolutely devastating for children. Childhood in the medieval period was not a time of innocence, play, and protection, but a desperate struggle for survival in a world designed to destroy the weak and vulnerable. Child labor began as soon as children could walk and follow simple instructions. By age 5 or 6, children were expected to contribute to family survival through dangerous and backbreaking work. They tended animals, worked in fields, carried heavy loads, and performed tasks that would be considered child abuse by any modern standard. The work was not light or age-appropriate. Medieval children hauled water from wells using buckets almost as heavy as they were. They collected animal dung for fuel, spending hours picking through manure with their bare hands. They herded livestock through dangerous terrain, risking attacks from wild animals and thieves. They worked in primitive mills grinding grain, where they could easily lose fingers or limbs in the machinery. Education was forbidden for most children and actively discouraged by authorities who believed that literacy and knowledge were dangerous for the lower classes. The vast majority of children never learned to read or write, ensuring they would remain trapped in poverty and ignorance for their entire lives. Even the children of nobles received only basic education, focused more on social etiquette and military training than intellectual development. Physical abuse of children was not only legal, but encouraged as necessary discipline. Children were beaten regularly with sticks, whips, and other implements for minor infractions or simply to teach them their place in society. The phrase "spare the rod, spoil the child" was taken literally, and children who escaped regular beatings were considered poorly raised. The implements used to beat children were often the same tools used for farm work or manufacturing. Wooden switches, leather straps, and metal rods left permanent scars and sometimes caused serious injuries or death. Parents who killed their children during discipline sessions faced no legal consequences, as children were considered property with no independent rights. Malnutrition stunted both physical and cognitive development. Most children never reached their full growth potential and suffered permanent developmental delays due to inadequate nutrition during critical growth periods. Medieval children were noticeably smaller and weaker than modern children, with many appearing years younger than their actual age due to stunted growth. The effects of chronic malnutrition went beyond physical appearance. Children's brains required adequate nutrition to develop properly, and medieval diets rarely provided sufficient protein, vitamins, and minerals for healthy cognitive development. This resulted in learning disabilities, memory problems, and reduced intellectual capacity that affected children throughout their lives. The psychological trauma of medieval childhood was severe and lasting. Children witnessed horrific violence, death, and suffering on a daily basis. They watched family members die from disease, starvation, and violence without any understanding or support to process these experiences. They saw public executions, torture, and mutilation treated as normal entertainment. Children were expected to accept death as a constant presence in their lives. They watched siblings die from disease or accident with frightening regularity, learning early that attachment to others would likely lead to heartbreak. This created a generation of emotionally numbed individuals who learned to suppress feelings as a survival mechanism. Many children were sold into indentured servitude or outright slavery by families who could not afford to feed them. These children faced lives of backbreaking labor, abuse, and exploitation with no hope of escape or improvement. They worked in dangerous occupations like mining, where cave-ins and toxic fumes killed workers regularly, or in manufacturing where they operated dangerous machinery without safety protections. Children sold into service often never saw their families again. They were treated as property by their owners, who had complete control over their lives, work, and physical well-being. Sexual abuse of child servants was common and unpunished, as children had no legal protections and no way to report or escape abuse. The constant threat of death created a childhood defined by fear rather than wonder. Children learned early that life was precarious and that they could die at any moment from disease, accident, or violence. This awareness shaped their personalities and worldviews in ways that would seem pathological by modern standards. Medieval children developed coping mechanisms that helped them survive but caused lasting psychological damage. They learned to be hypervigilant about threats, to suppress emotions that might be seen as weakness, and to accept violence and cruelty as normal parts of life. These adaptations helped them survive childhood, but often prevented them from forming healthy relationships or experiencing joy as adults. Accidents were common and often fatal for medieval children. They fell into wells, were trampled by livestock, burned in house fires, and drowned in rivers and ponds. The dangerous environments they lived and worked in, combined with inadequate supervision and safety measures, created countless opportunities for serious injury or death. The tools and equipment children used daily were designed for adults and were often dangerous in small hands. Sharp farming implements, heavy construction materials, and primitive machinery caused frequent accidents that would be easily preventable today. Medical care for injured children was minimal and often harmful, so even minor accidents could lead to infection, disability, or death. Disease struck children with particular severity due to their underdeveloped immune systems and poor nutrition. Common childhood diseases that are minor inconveniences today were often fatal in medieval times. Measles, mumps, whooping cough, and other infections killed thousands of children annually, while survivors often suffered permanent complications like deafness, blindness, or brain damage. The medieval understanding of child development was primitive and often harmful. Children were seen as miniature adults rather than individuals with special needs and developmental stages. They were expected to think, work, and behave like adults from a very early age, with no recognition that their brains and bodies needed time to mature properly. Religious indoctrination began in earliest childhood and was often terrifying and psychologically damaging. Children were taught that they were born sinful and deserved punishment, that death could come at any moment, and that eternal damnation awaited those who disobeyed religious authorities. These teachings created deep-seated fears and guilt that affected children throughout their lives. The concept of childhood as a special time of life worthy of protection and nurturing simply didn't exist in medieval society. Children were economic assets to be exploited, not individuals with rights and needs. This fundamental difference in attitude toward children created conditions that would be considered systematically abusive by any modern standard. Chapter 8: Childbirth and Women's Health, the Breeding Machine Nightmare. Childbirth in medieval times was essentially a death sentence waiting to happen. Without any understanding of basic hygiene, anatomy, or medical science, women faced astronomical risks every time they became pregnant. The process of bringing life into the world was more likely to end in death for both mother and child than in successful delivery. Medieval women were expected to be constantly pregnant throughout their childbearing years. Without reliable birth control methods, married women conceived child after child in rapid succession. The average medieval woman who survived to adulthood would endure 8-12 pregnancies during her lifetime, with little time to recover between births. The physical toll of constant pregnancy was devastating. Women's bodies were worn down by the repeated stress of carrying and delivering children. Malnutrition, already common among medieval people, became even more dangerous during pregnancy, when women needed additional nutrients to support growing babies. Most pregnant women were severely undernourished, leading to complications that would be easily preventable today. Midwives who assisted in births were typically older women with no formal training, relying entirely on folk wisdom and superstition passed down through generations. These women had no understanding of sterile technique, infection control, or proper obstetric procedures. They often made conditions worse through well-intentioned but dangerous interventions. The birthing environment itself was a breeding ground for infection. Women gave birth in the same dirty, unsanitary conditions they lived in daily. The straw-covered floors, unwashed linens, and contaminated water used during delivery introduced countless bacteria and pathogens into the birthing process. Open wounds from delivery were virtually guaranteed to become infected in these conditions. Medieval obstetric practices were based entirely on superstition rather than medical knowledge. Midwives might place religious relics on the laboring woman's abdomen, believing this would ensure safe delivery. They administered herbal concoctions that were often toxic, sometimes causing poisoning on top of the already dangerous birthing process. Some midwives performed procedures like manual manipulation of the baby that frequently caused internal injuries to both mother and child. Pain relief during labor was non-existent. Women endured hours or days of excruciating labor pain with no anesthesia or effective pain management. The screams of women in labor were so common that they became part of the normal soundscape of medieval communities. Many women died from shock and exhaustion before they could deliver their babies. Complications during delivery were automatic death sentences. Breech presentations, prolonged labor, and hemorrhaging conditions that are manageable with modern medical intervention almost always resulted in the death of mother, child, or both. When babies became stuck during delivery, midwives might attempt to extract them using crude tools or their bare hands, often causing catastrophic internal injuries to the mother. Cesarean sections were only performed on women who had already died in desperate attempts to save their babies. The procedure was considered so dangerous that it was never attempted on living women. Women with narrow pelvises or other anatomical issues that would require surgical intervention in modern times simply died in labor, along with their babies. Maternal mortality rates were catastrophic by any standard. Conservative estimates suggest that 10–20% of all medieval women died in childbirth, but the actual numbers were probably much higher. In some communities, childbirth was the leading cause of death among women of reproductive age. For every successful birth, multiple women in the community had died attempting to bring children into the world. The social implications of maternal mortality extended far beyond the immediate tragedy. When mothers died in childbirth, their newborn babies usually died shortly afterward, as there were no adequate substitutes for breast milk. Older children left motherless face grim prospects, as medieval society provided little support for orphans. Families were devastated by maternal death in ways that created cascading social and economic problems. Fathers left alone to care for multiple young children often had to abandon their work or remarry quickly out of desperation rather than choice. Communities lost their most productive members during their peak childbearing years, creating labor shortages and economic instability. Even women who survived childbirth faced ongoing health problems that shortened their lives and compromised their well-being. Injuries sustained during delivery often never healed properly, causing chronic pain and disability. Infections that began during childbirth could smolder for months or years, gradually weakening women and making them more susceptible to other diseases. The psychological trauma of medieval childbirth affected entire communities. Women lived in constant fear of pregnancy, knowing that each conception could be their death sentence. They watched friends and relatives die in labor regularly, creating an atmosphere of dread around what should have been a joyful life event. Many women developed what we would now recognize as severe depression and anxiety related to their reproductive experiences. The constant cycle of pregnancy, birth, and infant death created psychological wounds that never had time to heal. Women who lost multiple babies in infancy or early childhood often became emotionally numb as a survival mechanism. The medieval church's teachings about childbirth added another layer of trauma to the experience. Women were taught that pain in labor was divine punishment for Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden. This theological framework meant that seeking pain relief or medical intervention was seen as fighting against God's will. Women were expected to suffer in silence as part of their religious duty. Infant mortality rates were even more horrifying than maternal mortality statistics. Approximately half of all children born alive died before their 5th birthday, with many more perishing before reaching adulthood. The causes were numerous and largely preventable by modern standards: birth trauma, infections, congenital defects that would be easily treatable today, accidents, malnutrition, and simple neglect. Many babies were accidentally killed during delivery by inexperienced midwives who used excessive force or improper techniques. Others were born healthy but died within days from infections contracted during the birthing process. The same unsanitary conditions that threatened mothers' lives also created deadly environments for newborns. Premature babies had virtually no chance of survival. Without incubators, specialized feeding equipment, or knowledge of premature infant care, babies born even a few weeks early almost always died. Mothers who went into premature labor faced the double trauma of dangerous delivery and inevitable infant death. Postpartum care was minimal and often harmful. New mothers were expected to return to normal activities within days of giving birth, regardless of complications or injuries they had sustained. The concept of recovery time was virtually unknown, and women often suffered permanent damage because they couldn't rest and heal properly after delivery. Breastfeeding, while recognized as important, was fraught with difficulties that often proved fatal for infants. Malnourished mothers often couldn't produce adequate milk, leading to infant starvation. Breast infections were common and dangerous, sometimes requiring mothers to stop nursing even when no alternatives were available. When wet nurses were employed, they were often women from the same impoverished circumstances as the biological mothers, meaning they were likely to be malnourished and diseased themselves. The practice of wet nursing also spread diseases like syphilis and tuberculosis from nurse to infant. The medieval period represents one of the darkest chapters in the history of women's health and childbirth. The combination of ignorance, superstition, and unsanitary conditions created a system that was systematically deadly for both mothers and babies. Understanding these horrors helps explain why medieval populations grew so slowly despite high birth rates. The reproductive process itself was eliminating huge numbers of people before they could contribute to society. Chapter 9: Crime and Violence, when death lurked around every corner. Medieval society was incredibly violent, and we're not just talking about the occasional bar fight or domestic dispute. Violence was so endemic to daily life that the average person lived in constant fear of assault, robbery, murder, or worse. Let's start with simple theft, which was punishable by death in most medieval jurisdictions. The definition was so broad that almost any economic activity could be construed as theft by corrupt authorities looking for excuses to eliminate inconvenient people. Taking food from someone else's field, even if you were starving, was theft punishable by hanging. The penalties were brutal and disproportionate. For stealing anything worth more than a few pence, you could be hanged, drawn and quartered, or subjected to other forms of execution designed to maximize suffering. False accusations of theft were common and often impossible to disprove. A wealthy landowner claimed you had stolen from him. A word as a peasant carried no weight against his testimony. You could be executed based on nothing more than an accusation. Highway robbery was a constant threat for anyone who traveled. Medieval roads were dangerous places where bandits operated with virtual impunity. The isolation of medieval roads made them perfect hunting grounds for criminals. Urban violence was even worse than rural banditry. Medieval cities were crowded, poorly lit, and filled with desperate people competing for limited resources. Street violence was constant, and murder rates in medieval cities were 20 times higher than in modern urban areas. The narrow streets created countless opportunities for ambushes and attacks. The lack of street lighting meant most areas were pitch black after sunset, providing perfect cover for violent crimes. Weapons were commonly carried by most men, as personal protection was a necessity. Minor disputes could escalate to deadly confrontations within seconds, and the widespread availability of weapons made every argument potentially fatal. The concept of professional policing didn't exist in most medieval cities. Law enforcement was the responsibility of part-time watchmen and corrupt officials who were often criminals themselves. The justice system's reliance on brutal public punishment created a culture that celebrated and normalized extreme violence. Public executions were community entertainment events that drew live crowds of men, women, and children. Private vendettas and blood feuds were common and often lasted for generations, creating cycles of violence that could devastate entire communities. Domestic violence wasn't just tolerated, it was legally sanctioned and socially expected. Sexual violence was endemic and rarely punished, reflecting the low value placed on women's lives and bodily autonomy. The prevalence of alcohol made violence even more common and dangerous. Military violence spilled over into civilian life constantly, as professional soldiers often turned to banditry when not engaged in formal warfare. Religious violence was common and officially sanctioned by church and secular authorities. The constant threat of violence shaped every aspect of medieval life. People planned their daily activities around avoiding dangerous areas and situations. The normalization of violence created a society where cruelty was not just accepted but expected and celebrated. In this environment, every day was a potential life or death struggle. Murder rates in medieval cities were 50 times higher than in modern developed countries. The average medieval person witnessed more violence in a year than most modern people see in their entire lifetimes. Chapter 10: The Social Hierarchy or Place in the Human Pecking Order. Medieval society wasn't just unfair, it was systematically designed to crush the hopes, dreams and lives of the vast majority of people while concentrating all power, wealth, and opportunity in the hands of a tiny elite. If you were born a peasant, you would die a peasant, and your children and grandchildren would suffer the same fate for generations to come. The feudal system was essentially a pyramid of oppression, with the king at the top, followed by nobles, knights, clergy, and at the bottom, where 85–90% of the population lived, the peasants, serfs, and villeins who did all the actual work while receiving almost none of the benefits. As a serf, not quite a slave, but the distinction was meaningless in practical terms. You were legally bound to the land where you were born. This meant you could never leave without your lord's permission that was rarely granted and usually came with conditions that made freedom impossible to achieve. You didn't own the land you worked, the house you lived in, or even the tools you used for farming. Everything belonged to your lord, including the right to control where you lived, what work you did, whom you could marry, and even where you could go to church. The work expected of you was backbreaking and never-ending. You owed your lord a certain number of days of labor each week, typically 3 days out of 7, but this could increase to 6 or 7 days during busy periods like planting and harvest. These weren't regular 8-hour workdays. Either you worked from dawn to dusk, often 12–16 hours a day during busy seasons. The taxes and obligations you owed were crushing and seemingly endless. In addition to your labor, you owed a portion of everything you produced. The church demanded its share too, in the form of tithes, another 10% of your production. By the time you paid all your obligations, you were left with maybe 30–40% of what you produced if you were lucky. Marriage required your lord's permission, and he could refuse for any reason or no reason at all. Your children belonged to your lord as much as they belonged to you. They were bound to the same land and the same servitude from the moment they were born. Education was forbidden to serfs in many places and actively discouraged everywhere. Learning to read and write was considered above your station and potentially dangerous to the social order. Legal rights for serfs were minimal or non-existent. Your lord could punish you for infractions, both real and imagined, and there was little recourse to higher authorities. You couldn't testify against your lord in court, and your word carried no weight against that of any free person. Moving up in the social hierarchy was virtually impossible. Even becoming a free peasant required your lord's permission and usually a substantial payment that most serfs could never afford. The system was designed to be self-perpetuating and nearly impossible to escape. The psychological impact was devastating. Serfs lived with the constant knowledge that they had no control over their own lives, no hope for improvement, and no way to protect themselves or their families from the whims of their social superiors. Women faced additional restrictions at every level of society. A peasant woman had fewer legal rights than a peasant man, couldn't inherit property in her own name in most places, and was legally subordinate to her father, husband, or nearest male relative throughout her life. The medieval social hierarchy was a system of systematic oppression that successfully maintained extreme inequality for centuries through a combination of violence, propaganda, and structural constraints that made escape nearly impossible. Chapter 11. Travel and transportation. Every journey could be your last. In our modern world, we complain about flight delays and traffic jams. In medieval times, travel was so dangerous that many people never ventured more than 5 miles from where they were born. Every journey, no matter how short, was potentially fatal and required careful planning, adequate resources, and considerable luck to complete successfully. Most medieval roads were nothing more than dirt tracks that had been worn down by foot traffic and wagon wheels over centuries. During dry weather, these paths were dusty, rutted, and filled with holes that could break a horse's leg. During wet weather, they became impassable quagmires of mud. Road maintenance was the responsibility of local communities, but peasants were too busy trying to survive to spend time on infrastructure that primarily benefited travelers from elsewhere. The result was a transportation network that deteriorated steadily throughout the medieval period. Bridges were rare and often in terrible condition. Most rivers had to be crossed at fords, which were dangerous during high water and sometimes impossible to locate. Many travelers drowned attempting river crossings, including Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa during the Third Crusade. Navigation was primitive and unreliable. There were no accurate maps available to ordinary people. Travelers relied on verbal directions from locals who might be mistaken, malicious, or simply trying to direct traffic away from their communities. Getting lost was easy and potentially fatal. Without landmarks or reliable directions, travelers could wander for days in unfamiliar territory. During winter, getting lost meant almost certain death from exposure. The speed of travel is painfully slow by modern standards. A person on foot could cover maybe 50 minutes, 20 miles per day under ideal conditions. On horseback, you might manage 25 minutes, 30 miles if you had a good horse and favorable terrain. But these were best-case scenarios that rarely occurred. Horses were expensive to buy and maintain, putting them beyond the reach of most ordinary people. A good traveling horse cost as much as a modern car and required daily care that added significantly to travel expenses. Accommodation for travelers was scarce and dangerous. Inns were often no better than the hovels that local peasants lived in. You might share a bed with strangers, including people with infectious diseases. Many inns were actually fronts for criminal operations. Weather was an implacable enemy of medieval travelers. Rain could make roads impassable and destroy supplies. Snow could bury roads entirely and make navigation impossible. Winter travel was particularly dangerous and often impossible. Food and water procurement during travel was always problematic. Water sources were often contaminated, and there was no reliable way to purify water to make it safe to drink. Many travelers died from dysentery and other waterborne diseases contracted during their journeys. Legal problems could arise in different jurisdictions along travel routes. Laws varied dramatically from one region to another, and travelers might unknowingly break local ordinances that carried severe penalties. Women traveling alone faced additional dangers, including sexual assault and accusations of improper behavior. Most women couldn't travel without male escorts, which meant they were dependent on men who might themselves be dangerous. Sea travel was faster than overland routes, but much more dangerous. Medieval ships were small, poorly constructed, and vulnerable to storms that could sink them without warning. Many ships were lost at sea without any trace. Even successful journeys took enormous tolls on travelers' health and resources. The physical exertion, poor nutrition, exposure to weather, and constant stress left many people permanently weakened or damaged. Communication during travel was nearly impossible. If something went wrong, there was no way to send word to family about delays or problems. The unpredictability of travel made planning almost impossible. For most medieval people, the dangers of travel far outweighed any potential benefits. Only the wealthy, desperate, or foolhardy attempted long journeys with any regularity. The vast majority of the population lived and died within a few miles of where they were born. Chapter 12: The Plague and Epidemics, when death came for entire civilizations. No discussion of medieval horrors would be complete without examining the single most catastrophic event of the period, the Black Death. This pandemic, which swept through Europe between 1347 and 1351, killed between 75 and 200 million people, roughly 30–60% of Europe's population. But the Black Death was just the most famous of many epidemics that regularly devastated medieval populations. The plague arrived in Europe via trade routes from Asia, carried by fleas that lived on black rats aboard merchant ships. The disease came in three forms: bubonic plague, which caused massive swelling of lymph nodes called buboes; pneumonic plague, which attacked the lungs; and septicemic plague, which infected the bloodstream. All three were usually fatal. Medieval people had no understanding of how diseases spread, so their attempts to combat the plague were not only useless but often made the situation worse. Many believed the plague was caused by miasma, poisonous air, so they burned aromatic woods and herbs, creating smoke that actually helped spread airborne pathogens. Others thought it was divine punishment for sin, leading to religious processions that brought infected and healthy people together in large crowds. The symptoms of plague were horrifying and unmistakable. Bubonic plague began with sudden fever and chills, followed by the appearance of bubo-swollen lymph nodes the size of apples or eggs, usually in the groin, armpits, or neck. These buboes were excruciatingly painful and often burst, releasing pus and blood. The skin around then turned black, giving the disease its popular name. Victims suffered from severe headaches, muscle aches, and delirium. Many developed dark patches on their skin as blood vessels burst beneath the surface. The pneumonic form caused victims to cough up blood and struggle to breathe as their lungs filled with fluid. Most died within 3 to 7 days of showing symptoms. The social and psychological impact of the plague was as devastating as its physical effects. Entire families were wiped out within days. Children watched their parents die horrible deaths, knowing they would likely be next. Parents had to choose which children to care for when multiple family members fell ill simultaneously. Normal social structures collapsed completely in plague-stricken areas. There weren't enough healthy people to bury the dead, so bodies piled up in streets and houses, creating additional health hazards. Many churches and monasteries lost their entire populations, including the clergy who were supposed to provide spiritual comfort to the dying. The economic disruption was catastrophic. Entire villages were abandoned as their populations died. Agricultural production collapsed when there weren't enough surviving workers to tend crops or harvest them. Trade routes were disrupted as merchants and travelers died or refused to risk exposure to the disease. Some communities turned to scapegoating as a way to cope with the inexplicable disaster. Jews were particularly targeted, accused of poisoning wells or conspiring with the devil to spread the plague. Entire Jewish communities were massacred by mobs looking for someone to blame for their suffering. The plague also triggered extremist religious movements. Groups of flagellants traveled from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in public displays of penance, believing that their suffering would appease God's wrath. These processions actually helped spread the disease as infected flagellants moved from community to community. Medical responses to the plague were not only ineffective, but often accelerated death. Physicians still believed in the theory of fumers and prescribed bloodletting for plague victims, weakening patients who desperately needed their strength to fight the infection. They also recommended purging and induced vomiting, causing additional fluid loss in patients who were already dehydrated from fever. Some doctors wore elaborate protective costumes that included leather robes, gloves, boots, and distinctive beak-shaped masks filled with aromatic herbs. While these outfits may have provided some protection from fleas, they were based on the incorrect belief that plague was spread through bad air rather than by actual contact with infected animals or people. The plague's impact on art, literature, and culture was profound. The constant presence of death led to a genre of art called memento mori, reminders of mortality that appeared in paintings, sculptures, and manuscripts. The famous dance of death imagery showed skeletons leading people of all social classes to their graves, reflecting the plague's indiscriminate killing. But the Black Death was not the only epidemic disease that terrorized medieval populations. Smallpox, typhus, dysentery, and influenza regularly swept through communities, killing thousands and weakening survivors for future outbreaks. Leprosy was another feared disease that, while less immediately fatal than plague, caused horrible disfigurement and social ostracism. People with leprosy were required to ring bells to warn others of their approach and were often forced to live in isolated colonies outside town walls. Ergotism, caused by eating grain infected with ergot fungus, created outbreaks of madness, hallucinations, and gangrene. Entire communities would sometimes experience collective symptoms that were attributed to witchcraft or demonic possession, leading to panic and violence. The frequency of epidemics meant that medieval people lived with constant fear of disease. Parents knew that most of their children would die young. Communities developed fatalistic attitudes toward illness and death, seeing epidemic disease as an unavoidable part of life rather than something that could be prevented or treated. The cumulative effect of repeated epidemics was a population that was constantly weakened by malnutrition, previous illnesses, and poor living conditions. This made people more susceptible to new diseases and less likely to survive when they became infected. Recovery from major epidemics could take generations, as communities had to rebuild their populations, restore agricultural production, and re-establish trade networks. Some areas never fully recovered, remaining depopulated and economically marginal for centuries after major plague outbreaks. Chapter 13. War and Conflict when Violence was the Ultimate Arbiter. Medieval Europe was almost constantly at war. Between major conflicts, there were smaller wars, raids, sieges, and various other forms of organized violence that made peaceful life nearly impossible. War wasn't an occasional disruption to normal life, it was a constant background reality that shaped every aspect of medieval society. The causes of medieval warfare were numerous and often petty by modern standards. Kings fought over inheritance claims, territorial disputes, trade routes, and personal insults. Nobles waged private wars against their neighbors over everything from property boundaries to romantic rivalries. Religious differences provided justification for crusades, inquisitions, and holy wars that devastated entire regions. The conduct of medieval warfare was brutal beyond modern comprehension. There were no Geneva Conventions, no rules of engagement, and no protection for civilians. Armies routinely targeted non-combatants, burned crops, destroyed villages, and slaughtered anyone who got in their way. Siege warfare was particularly horrific. Cities under siege faced starvation as food supplies dwindled. Attackers would catapult diseased animal carcasses over walls to spread plague and other diseases. When cities finally fell, the victorious armies often massacred the entire population, including women, children, and elderly people who had nothing to do with the conflict. The weapons of medieval warfare were designed to cause maximum damage and suffering. Swords, axes, maces, and other hand weapons could hack limbs off or crush skulls. Crossbow bolts and arrows could pierce armor and pin victims to walls or ground. Later innovations like early cannons and firearms added new dimensions of terror to medieval battlefields. Professional soldiers were often little better than organized bandits. They were expected to live off the land, which meant stealing food, animals, and other supplies from the civilian population they encountered. When armies passed through an area, they left behind a trail of burned villages, slaughtered livestock, and traumatized survivors. The feudal system made every lord a potential warlord with his own private army. Knights and men-at-arms owed military service to their overlords, creating a web of military obligations that could drag entire regions into conflict when disputes arose between powerful families. Mercenary companies added another layer of danger to the medieval landscape. These professional warriors fought for whoever paid them best, switching sides frequently and showing loyalty only to money. When not employed in official campaigns, they often turned to banditry, extortion, and freelance warfare that terrorized civilian populations. The economic impact of constant warfare was devastating. Fields were burned, livestock slaughtered, and trade routes disrupted. Armies consumed enormous resources: food, weapons, horses, and other supplies that had to be taken from already struggling agricultural communities. Taxation to support military campaigns crushed peasant families who were already living on the edge of survival. Kings and nobles demanded extraordinary levies for their wars, forcing communities to choose between bankruptcy and rebellion. Many regions were completely impoverished by the cost of supporting their rulers' military ambitions. The human cost of medieval warfare was staggering. Battle casualties were enormous, as medieval combat was close quarters fighting with edged weapons that caused horrible wounds. Medical care for wounded soldiers was minimal, so many who survived the initial fighting died slowly from infected wounds, blood loss, or disease. Civilian casualties were often even higher than military losses. Armies routinely murdered non-combatants, raped women, enslaved children, and destroyed entire communities. The passage of an army through a region could reduce thriving settlements to smoking ruins filled with corpses. The psychological trauma of living in a world of constant warfare affected everyone in medieval society. Children grew up expecting violence, parents lived in fear of losing their families to war, and communities developed siege mentalities that made normal social and economic development impossible. Women faced particular horrors during wartime. Rape was so common that it was considered a normal part of military campaigns. Women and girls were routinely sexually assaulted by soldiers, and many were kidnapped and forced into sexual slavery. Pregnant women and new mothers received no special protection and were often targeted for particularly brutal treatment. The fortified castles and walled towns that dotted the medieval landscape were testimony to the constant threat of violence. These defensive structures required enormous resources to build and maintain, resources that could have been used to improve living conditions but instead had to be diverted to protection from human predators. Castle sieges could last for months or even years, creating conditions of extreme hardship for defenders and attackers alike. Starvation, disease, and psychological stress took their toll on everyone involved. When sieges finally ended, they often resulted in massacre and destruction that left regions depopulated for generations. The religious wars of the medieval period added ideological fanaticism to an already violent culture. Crusades were launched against Muslims, Jews, pagans, and Christian heretics, creating a culture where killing in God's name was not only acceptable but spiritually rewarding. The Crusades themselves were exercises in organized barbarity that devastated both Christian and Muslim territories. Crusading armies massacred entire populations, destroyed ancient cultural sites, and created lasting hatreds between religious communities that persist to this day. Even during periods of nominal peace, the threat of violence was never far away. Border raids, cattle rustling, kidnapping for ransom, and other forms of low-level warfare continued almost constantly. The feudal system's emphasis on personal honor and martial prowess meant that almost any insult or disagreement could escalate into armed conflict. The technology of medieval warfare evolved constantly as combatants sought new ways to kill their enemies more effectively. The introduction of crossbows, longbows, early firearms, and improved armor created an arms race that consumed enormous resources and led to ever more destructive conflicts. Naval warfare added another dimension of horror to medieval conflict. Ships were rammed, boarded, and burned with their crews still aboard. Pirates and naval raiders terrorized coastal communities, enslaving populations and destroying port cities. The lack of effective naval medicine meant that wounded sailors often died horrible deaths far from medical care. The end of wars rarely brought lasting peace, as victorious armies had to be demobilized and defeated populations had to be controlled. Former soldiers often turned to banditry when their military service ended, while conquered territories seethed with resentment that frequently erupted into new conflicts. Chapter 14. Conclusion: Why Modern Life is a Miracle. After this comprehensive journey through the horrors of medieval life, you should have a profound appreciation for the miraculous nature of modern existence. Every single aspect of your daily life, from the moment you wake up until you go to sleep, represents centuries of human progress that have lifted us out of the medieval nightmare and into a world of unprecedented safety, comfort, and opportunity. Consider your morning routine once more, but now with the full knowledge of what medieval people endured. You wake up in a bed with clean sheets, in a structurally sound building with reliable heating and cooling, protected by smoke detectors and sprinkler systems that would have seemed like divine intervention to medieval people whose homes regularly burned down around them. You flip a switch and electric lights instantly illuminate the room, no struggling with flint and steel, no rationing precious candles, no living in perpetual dimness that caused vitamin deficiencies and psychological disorders. The electricity flowing through your walls represents a mastery of natural forces that medieval people would have attributed to supernatural powers. You turn a handle and clean, safe water flows out at whatever temperature you desire, water that has been treated to remove the bacteria, parasites, and toxins that killed millions of our ancestors. The complex infrastructure of reservoirs, treatment plants, and distribution systems that makes this possible represent one of humanity's greatest achievements in public health. Your private bathroom, with its flush toilet and proper sewage disposal, eliminates the waste management nightmares that turned medieval cities into open sewers and breeding grounds for deadly diseases. The soap and shampoo you use routinely would have been luxury items beyond the reach of medieval royalty. You open a refrigerator stocked with fresh, safe food from around the world, fruits and vegetables available year-round, meat that has been properly inspected and refrigerated, dairy products that won't give you tuberculosis or brucellosis. The variety and safety of your food supply would seem like the magical abundance of heaven to people who lived with constant hunger and food poisoning. Your morning news, delivered instantly via television, radio, or internet, gives you more information about world events than medieval kings could gather about their own kingdoms. Your smartphone contains more computing power than entire medieval civilizations could have imagined, connecting you instantly to the accumulated knowledge of humanity and allowing you to communicate with people anywhere on Earth. The medical care available to you represents advances that would seem like miraculous healing to medieval people. Antibiotics can cure the infections that killed millions of our ancestors in agonizing deaths. Vaccines prevent the diseases that terrorized entire civilizations. Surgery can repair injuries and conditions that were automatic death sentences in medieval times. Even your basic first aid kit contains medical technology more advanced than anything available to medieval emperors. Your legal rights and protections exist in a different universe from medieval concepts of justice. You have the right to a fair trial with legal representation, protection from cruel and unusual punishment, due process of law, and presumption of innocence. You cannot be tortured to extract confessions, executed for minor thefts, or punished based on the accusations of more powerful people without evidence and proper legal proceedings. The social mobility available to you is unprecedented in human history. You can choose your own career path based on your interests and abilities rather than your birth circumstances. You can marry whom you love rather than accepting an arrangement made by your parents for political or economic reasons. You can live where you choose, travel freely, and determine your own future through your decisions and efforts. Women in modern society enjoy rights and freedoms that medieval women couldn't have imagined in their wildest dreams. You can own property, pursue education and careers, choose your own spouse or remain single, have control over your reproductive choices, and participate fully in political and economic life. The systematic oppression that defined women's lives for centuries has largely been swept away in the developed world. The food security you enjoy is almost incomprehensible from a medieval perspective. You have probably never experienced real hunger, never worried about starving to death, never eaten moldy bread because it was your only option. The variety, safety, and abundance of modern food would seem like an eternal feast to people who lived with constant food insecurity and the ever-present threat of famine. Transportation that seemed impossibly dangerous to our ancestors is now routine and remarkably safe. You can travel thousands of miles in hours with minimal risk of death, robbery, or getting lost. You can cross oceans in comfort and safety, communicate with people anywhere during your journey, and arrive at your destination with your health and wealth intact. The education available to you far exceeds what was available to medieval nobility and royalty. You can learn about any subject that interests you, develop skills that match your abilities, and acquire knowledge that gives you power over your own life and circumstances. The literacy that was reserved for tiny elite is now considered a basic requirement for participation in modern society. Your work, however challenging it might sometimes seem, takes place in safe conditions with legal protections, reasonable hours, and compensation that allows you to live with dignity. You have workers' rights that protect you from exploitation, safety regulations that prevent industrial accidents, and the freedom to change jobs if you're dissatisfied with your current position. Even your leisure time represents a luxury that medieval people couldn't imagine. You have access to entertainment, education, travel, hobbies, and personal development opportunities that would have seemed like the privileges of gods to people who spent every waking moment struggling for survival. Your problems and challenges, real and significant as they may be, exist on a completely different level from the daily life or death struggles of medieval existence. You worry about career advancement, relationship issues, financial planning, and personal fulfillment concerns that assume a basic level of safety, security, and opportunity that our ancestors never experienced. The environmental quality of your life surpasses that of medieval royalty. You breathe air that isn't filled with smoke and toxins, drink water that won't kill you with dysentery, and live in spaces that aren't infested with vermin and parasites. The chronic diseases caused by medieval environmental conditions have largely disappeared from the developed world. Your life expectancy is more than double what it was in medieval times, and those extra decades are generally healthy, productive years rather than a prolonged decline into infirmity. You can expect to see your children grow up, meet your grandchildren, and enjoy a retirement that medieval people couldn't even conceive of. The security you enjoy, both physical and economic, allows you to plan for the future in ways that were impossible for our ancestors. You can save money, invest in education and skills, build a career over decades, and make long-term commitments because you live in a stable society with functioning institutions that protect your rights and property. Your individual worth and dignity are recognized and protected in ways that represent a fundamental revolution in human thinking. You have inherent rights that cannot be taken away by accidents of birth, gender, or social class. You are valued as a human being with your own thoughts, feelings, and aspirations, rather than as property or a unit of labor to be exploited by social superiors. The scientific knowledge that shapes your world has eliminated most of the ignorance and superstition that made medieval life so dangerous and unpredictable. You understand disease, whether agriculture, physics, chemistry, and countless other phenomena that seem magical and terrifying to our ancestors who lacked basic scientific knowledge. The social safety nets available to you provide security that medieval people never had. Emergency services respond when you call for help. Medical care is available when you're sick or injured. Employment assistance exists if you lose your job. These systems aren't perfect, but they prevent the kind of catastrophic personal disasters that regularly destroyed medieval lives. Your freedom to think, speak, and believe what you choose represents centuries of struggle against the authoritarianism and religious oppression that characterized medieval society. You can question authority, express dissent, participate in governance, and live according to your own values without fear of execution, torture, or persecution. The diversity and tolerance of modern society allows people of different backgrounds, beliefs, and lifestyles to coexist peacefully. The religious conflicts, ethnic hatreds, and social prejudices that made medieval societies so violent and oppressive have largely been overcome in developed nations, though vigilance is required to prevent their return. The technological tools available to you amplify human capabilities in ways that give you powers our ancestors have attributed to divine intervention. You can communicate instantly across any distance, access information that would have taken medieval scholars lifetimes to gather, travel faster than the fastest medieval horse, and accomplish tasks that would have required armies of workers in the past. Their children have opportunities and protections that represent the hopes and dreams of countless generations of parents who couldn't provide such advantages. They can expect to live long, healthy, productive lives with educational opportunities, career choices, and personal freedoms that were unimaginable to medieval children who faced lives of predetermined servitude and struggle. The next time you complain about traffic jams, remember medieval people who never traveled more than 5 miles from home because the journey could kill them. When you're frustrated by slow internet, remember that medieval people had no way to communicate with anyone beyond shouting distance. When your food delivery is late, remember the medieval peasants who watched their children starve during famines while nobles feasted in their castles. When you visit the doctor for a minor ailment, remember the medieval patients who died from infections that antibiotics could cure in days. When you flip a light switch and nothing happens, remember the medieval families who lived in perpetual darkness, burning furniture to stay warm. When you turn on a faucet and the water runs brown, remember that medieval people drank from the same sources they used as sewers. Every modern convenience, every right you enjoy, every freedom you exercise exists because countless generations fought, suffered, and died to drag humanity out of the medieval abyss. Your ancestors endured unimaginable hardships so that you could live in comfort and safety that would seem like paradise to anyone from the medieval world. The progress of human civilization is not guaranteed, and the advances we've made are not permanent. Societies can collapse, knowledge can be lost, and hard-won freedoms can disappear in a single generation. The medieval period reminds us how fragile civilization truly is and how easily we could slip back into darkness if we're not vigilant in protecting what we've built. But perhaps most importantly, this journey through medieval horrors should inspire profound gratitude for the miracle of modern life. You are living better than any medieval king, with access to wonders that would have seemed like magic to our ancestors. You have opportunities, freedoms, and possibilities that billions of people throughout history could never have imagined. The medieval period lasted for roughly 1,000 years, encompassing dozens of generations who lived and died in conditions of unimaginable hardship. They endured plagues, famines, wars, and oppression not because they were weak or inferior, but because they lacked the knowledge, technology, and social structures that we take for granted today. This suffering was not meaningless, it was the foundation upon which our modern world was built. Every medical advance, every scientific discovery, every expansion of human rights was paid for with the blood, sweat, and tears of people who dreamed of a better world but never lived to see it. We owe it to them and to future generations to remember where we came from, to appreciate what we have, and to continue the long struggle to make life better for all humanity. The medieval period may be behind us, but the work of civilization continues, and it requires the efforts of every generation to move humanity forward rather than backward. So embrace your modern life with joy and gratitude. Celebrate every small convenience, every minor freedom, every ordinary day that passes without plague, famine, or war. You are living in the most prosperous, peaceful, and free time in human history, a golden age that would seem like heaven to anyone who endured the hell of medieval existence. And remember that this golden age exists not by accident, but by design, the result of centuries of human progress, struggle, and sacrifice. Honor that legacy by living your life to the fullest, treating others with dignity and respect, and working to make the world even better for those who come after us. The medieval period was humanity's dark age, but it was not our final destination. We have climbed out of that abyss through knowledge, compassion, and the unbreakable human spirit that refuses to accept suffering as inevitable. As long as we remember where we came from and remain committed to human progress, we will never return to the darkness of the medieval world. You've made it to the end. That means you survived this brutal journey through medieval life with us. If you found this dark tale enlightening, please consider subscribing to our channel, Lizzie Historian, and give this video a thumbs up. I truly appreciate every one of you for watching and joining me on this journey through history's harsh realities. Remember, every comfort we enjoy today came from centuries of human struggle and progress. Until next time, stay curious, stay grateful, and keep exploring the fascinating and often terrifying story of our shared human past.